Good morning, everybody. How are you? How are you doing? You all right? Here's some fundamental questions that convey interest, empathy, engagement, courtesy, perhaps compassion. We ask those questions on a daily basis, negotiating complicated webs of interactions with others in all sorts of social configurations. The answer might be, I'm fine, thank you. It is a response that may open a rich conversation about life in general or about the current situation in general. Potentially a culturally appropriate response, especially in the country where I'm speaking to you from, would be a response that acknowledges the question, but does not necessarily tell us anything about the real condition the person is in, their physical or their emotional state, their achievements, their worries. I'm fine, thank you. So in some cultural contexts, I'm fine, thanks, is the only appropriate response to the question. Do you know your blood pressure? Wait, let me take it for you. Which is, of course, a decontextualized measurement of a single indicator producing a very specific, discrete result. Well, it's 163/90, which is the discrete response to that question. It informs us, according to medical consensus, the person is not well and at risk of developing severe illness, stroke, heart attack, kidney disease, you name it. But it doesn't tell us anything about the systemic conditions that may underlie the problem. For example, excitement due to presenting to a conference, but also things like potential prolonged chronic self-harm, smoking, abuse of alcohol, stress, anxiety due to untenable conditions at work or at home, malnutrition due to poverty, and the list goes on. So casually asking, how are you, without engaging in further continuous engagement and conversation, or taking the blood pressure without carefully contextualizing the measure, neither of these approaches gives us sufficient information that enables us to engage with the person, the situation, in supportive and meaningful ways. Let's look at early childhood education, at our early childhood systems, our practices. As early childhood educators, we've been asking, how are you, in various ways since the beginning of our profession. Children's well-being in the here and now, referring to Janusz Korczak, and in the long term, the future, underpins our professional practice. More recently, we've been taking measurements that are often disconnected from the context, the cultural context, the historical, political, economic, and last but not least, the child. Sometimes we're taking these measurements to produce a single raw score, which is a quote from the English baseline assessment. Sometimes we take these measurements to produce large-scale comparisons between countries, which is the case, for instance, in the latest iteration of the OECD large-scale standardized assessments, the International Early Learning and Child Wellbeing Study. Thinking about evaluation, developing a better understanding of what's going on and with whom, I argue, is a crucial aspect of professional practice in early childhood education and care, whether we work with children or anywhere else in the early childhood system. Without evaluation, there can be no reassurance that we're actually achieving what we aspire to. More just and equitable experiences and outcomes for all children, which is taking a position which is open for debate. As a public and political practice, education must engage not only with young children, but the values of the society and the world we're educating children for. In everyday conversations, but also in the literature and in also professional conversations, evaluation and assessment are often used in combination, evaluation and assessment, or even interchangeably, as if they were the same. in combination, for instance, in the title of a research project that the Research Center Filiorum at Stavanger University and the Early Childhood Research Center here in Dublin are currently conducting in 5 Nordic countries. It does matter, however, how we speak about early childhood education and how we pay critical attention to the dominant discourses in reference to Michel Foucault that systematically, as he writes, form the objects, and I add the subjects of which they speak. To evaluate and to assess, we do both in early childhood education. But words convey meaning and shape practices. Assessment, you could say, is a professional task performed by professionals, educators, pedagogues, teachers, experts on others, children, for instance. So the agency, and some might say the power, rests with the expert, with you, with us, the assessor. Evaluation, you could say, conveys notions of values. It's embedded in the word, and the practice of valuing. But of course, the term evaluation in itself does not automatically acknowledge the agency of all who are involved: children, educators, families, community, society. Just talking about evaluation instead of assessment doesn't really bring all these different groups and individuals and their interests and aspirations into the picture. But it does open the possibility of recognizing, enacting diverse and different values, viewpoints, aspirations, judgments. It is a frame of thinking, evaluation, that implies reciprocity. My values as the evaluator, as being engaged in interactions with children, with educators, with others in the center, my values are potentially being challenged. I have to engage, I have to take a position and engage with your values. And this is something that enters us, or has the potential of entering us into dialogue or a multilogue of many voices, into democratic engagement, and offers the possibility of a collective agency rather than an agency resting with the expert, the assessor. But then, of course, we have to ask, what are we doing this for? And quite often, you might say, let's do an evaluation to find out, does it actually work, what we're intending to do? What works? But as Gert Biester reminds us, the focus on that what works question quite often makes it really difficult, if not impossible, to ask the question of what it should work for. What is the actual purpose of what we're doing here in early child education, in our local kindergarten, in our local setting? And more important, or really important, who should have a say in determining this? Whose voices are included, whose viewpoints, whose perspectives are heard and systematically included into our processes of evaluation. The question, of course, is, does this matter, and how and why in the Nordic context and beyond? What we're seeing at the moment, when we step outside of the European and Nordic picture at the moment, for a moment, what we're seeing is that early childhood education on a global scale is currently experiencing what I call a systemic turn, and that has brought new attention, and I think urgently brought new attention to the complexities of early childhood systems and to their rapidly changing contexts. So we're looking increasingly at whole pictures, at whole systems, at the various different levels of an early childhood system. What happens in the setting, what happens in policy, what happens in between the different agencies, what happens at the local, the national, the regional level. And this systemic turn, which is at the moment really pushed by a number of the big actors in that field, including, for instance, the World Bank and the OECD, and we're going to return to that in a minute. This systemic turn obviously predates the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has been accelerated by it because we've seen that our early childhood systems as vital parts of the social infrastructure of societies have come under enormous strain, sometimes to the point or beyond the point of collapse. The systemic turn raises, among many other questions, the question of the purpose of early child education in times of increasing uncertainty and increasing converging global crisis, including pandemics, climate crisis, the crisis of democracy, the crisis of policy and peace, and many others that are converging on us in this world. This is what the World Bank has to say in an analysis published in 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the deep inadequacies in the current system of childcare. And we have to sort of put something in bracket here. They're talking about childcare. Let's talk about the very fundamental role of early child education and care in realizing the right of every child to education from birth. But it has, says the World Bank, laid bare the deep inadequacies in the current system of childcare provision, including uneven access, poor quality, the need for public finance, poor terms of employment for the workforce, and the overall vulnerability of the sector. Oops, I have to go back here. This is from a even more recent document published by the Organization for Economic Collaboration and Development, the OECD, in this year, actually, 2021. And the OECD comes to the following analysis. Discontent is rising around the world, reflecting dysfunctions and injustices that have emerged in the economic, social, and political systems. It is also a response to the damage humankind is inflicting on the world's natural systems, and thus, inevitably, upon itself. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed these defects to devastating effect. The OECD then move on to say, so where to from here? They say as countries plan their recovery from the multiple crises triggered by the pandemic, they have an opportunity to make these systems more inclusive, more sustainable, more resilient, and more responsive. And this, they conclude, can only happen the active participation of citizens in new forms of collective action at the local, the national, and the international level. What are the implications for early childhood education and care? And what are the implications for evaluation? We're currently conducting a research project in collaboration between the Early Childhood Research Centre here at Dublin City University and the Centre for Early Childhood Education Care Research, Filiorum, at the University of Stavanger. In 5 countries, 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden in alphabetical order. The title of the project is Nordic Approaches to Evaluation and Assessment in Early Childhood Education and Care. And we're talking with educators, policymakers, academics in those 5 countries. We're looking across the literature, professional texts, academic journals, policies, and we're going to publish the report, all going well, next year. This is what we've been asked to do by the Nordic Council of Ministers. The purpose of our study, they're telling us, is to shed light on the values and principles that have guided the evaluation and assessment of the quality of early child education and care in the various Nordic countries, the ways in which evaluation and quality assessment have been developed in the Nordic countries, and the parties responsible for carrying out the evaluation and assessment. So here's the link to what I've been talking about in rather broad brushstrokes what's happening on a global scale. It is the principles, the values underpinning evaluation. It is the practices of evaluation, and it is the who is actually involved in carrying out evaluation and assessment. Is there any coherence across the Nordic countries? Can we talk about something like such a thing as a Nordic approach? And what are the links between evaluation, assessment, and the development of pedagogical practice on a day-to-day basis? These are the questions that we're exploring in this project. So what are we finding? And this, of course, is preliminary, as always. It is work in progress, and it's under constant discussion with our partners. One thing that sort of comes across, I think that is going to be quite important, is that the Nordic discourse, no matter who you talk to, and this is across practitioners, policymakers, academics, the way evaluation and assessment are talked about is dominated by questions of children's well-being, children's rights, democratic values. And the way evaluation is seen as a practice is that it's seen as an everyday practice, as something that takes place in the settings, in pedagogical interactions, is carried out by educators in the pedagogical practice. It is something that's processual. It doesn't happen sort of as a one-off activity, but it's something that you do as you go along, as you work with children and families in your settings. It is shaped, and that's quite interesting, very importantly at local, that is municipal level. It is increasingly, and this is where the sort of a potential tension comes into the field, it's increasingly governed at national level. So we have evaluation frameworks, agencies, guidelines, expectations of that evaluation is to be carried out and how it is to be carried out. So here's a potential tension coming into the picture. But interestingly, it does not affect that broad consensus about the central role of the local. And this is something that we're discussing at the moment in this project. This is, we think, at odds with a sort of Anglo-Saxon model that assumes central control and standardization as the main ways of shaping evaluation in our field. So looking forward, what we can say is that the Nordic approach, as far as it is sort of a working term emerging from our project, is pretty much in line with the emerging systemic turn at global level that recognizes the importance of the local in establishing and maintaining competent early childhood systems. It does lend itself to evaluating increasingly multi-sectoral and integrated early childhood development, education, and care systems. When you look, for instance, at some of the initiatives now being promoted in the Global South by the World Bank, but also across G20, the group of 20 countries, and the G20 early childhood policy initiatives that increasingly point towards multi-sectoral, integrated, whole of government responsibility for early childhood development, education, and care. It does open the possibility, and I think the urgent necessity, to engage in conversations with such integrated approaches that sometimes are much more developed in regions in the Global South than they are in Europe. For instance, in some South American countries, but also in India. And it is going to approach the Nordic, is going to inform the Nordic approach, rather, the debate that is on the beginning in Europe at the moment. The European Commission has just approved the mandate for the its working group on early child education and care for the coming years, beginning in 2022, or yeah, I'd say 2022, to have a focus on evaluation. So what we're doing in this project, what you're doing in your day-to-day practice, what you're doing in your academic work is going to be extremely important to inform that discussion and to feed into the discussion between sort of a democratic, value-based, the participatory approach to evaluation that is based very much on local interpretation in a European context. I'm going to leave you with a little note of caution, but also an interesting, I find an inspiring quote that's nothing to do with early childhood and has everything to do with early childhood and with how we carry out evaluations in our early childhood systems. This is Robert Persick, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, always worth rereading. And he's not talking about early childhood evaluation, he's talking about putting together a rotisserie, a barbecue equipment. And he says, looking at the instructions that come with the thing, what's really angering about instructions of this sort is that they imply there's only one way to put this rotisserie together, their way. And that presumption wipes out all the creativity. Actually, there are hundreds of ways to put the rotisserie together, and when they make you follow just one way without showing you the overall problem, the instructions become hard to follow in such a way as not to make mistakes. You lose feeling for the work, and not only that, it's very unlikely that they've told you the best way. Thank you.